This is The Law Show on CL 650. Now back to the show.
Fascinating show today with the very capable assistance of Gordon Maynard and Rudy Kisher, immigration lawyers with Maynard Kisher Stojkovic in Vancouver, downtown at 1168 Hamilton Street. You can find them online at vancouverlaw.ca. Gordon Maynard, we're talking about the categories in which people routinely get denied entry into Canada or residency in Canada. One of them is under the non-compliance. Then you zoom in on something called residency requirements. Help us out with this. What exactly are the immigration officers looking at when they examine your residency requirements?
They're talking about the people who are immigrants in Canada,
okay,
not visitors, people who have come here as immigrants, so they're living in Canada. And just a bit of background to it. Permanent residents in Canada have a residency obligation. In the old law, prior to 2002, they also had a residency obligation. It was set up in the idea that you would lose your permanent residence if you were outside of Canada with the intention of abandoning Canada.
Okay.
But they could not enforce that. So there were cases where people had been outside of Canada for 30 years. People who had come to Canada as children, but as adults they returned to the States and were working in the States, coming back every year to see their mother at Christmas, etc.
We never had a case like that, Gordon.
And then after 30 years, when they retire from their job, they go back to Canada. And at that point, the officer says, I think you lost your status. I think you abandoned it. But it was so hard to prove because you had to show that they had the intention to abandon Canada. So when they rewrote the law, they put in a residency obligation, and it's days. You count the days that your feet are in Canada.
So this is kind of the flip of what they do when we snowbird down in Hawaii or Florida or Arizona, because we have to count the number of days we're out of Canada. So the flip side of that coin is for people who are, we used to call them landed immigrants, but now they're permanent residents. They are now required to count the number of days they must be in Canada every year. And what's that number, Gordon?
It is 730 days out of each 5-year period. So 2 years out of each 5-year period.
40% of the time.
40% of the time. It's quite reasonable. It doesn't have to be all at once. You could spend 2 months here and 2 months there and 2 months there. As long as when you look at a 5-year window, you can count 2 years in Canada. All right. So that is your residency obligation, and we enforce it because people have permanent resident cards and they expire every 5 years. And when you have an expired card and you renew it, you have to show the government that you've met the residency obligation.
Okay,
all
sure.
Right? So what happens is people who are permanent residents in Canada, they're outside of Canada, they're spending too much time out of Canada, their card expires, now they can't get on the plane to come back to Canada. They go to the visa office and say, quick, give me a document to let me come back to Canada. And the officer says, show me you've been living here. They get reported. Residency breach. Now, since 2002, this has become a very active area of enforcement.
Okay.
And so because they're permanent residents, they've been reported for not being in Canada enough. They get a removal order. The officer can issue the removal order themselves. They appeal it, and now they go to the appeal, and they have to convince the tribunal that they should be allowed to keep their permanent resident status even though they haven't been here enough, or that the days were counted wrong. They have been here enough.
I would suspect that in terms of because we've been discussing the way these changes to the immigration law have been impacting the general public, and there have been sort of negative, positive reactions across the board because it's so complex. I would think in this case, though, Rudy, when it comes to the specifics of you want to be a Canadian, you want to become a permanent resident, well then show a little desire. I don't think that one would resonate badly at all with most of the Canadian public.
Oh, I don't think.
Or with the lawyers.
With the lawyers, I think it's a good system because at the end of the day, people like to have some sort of concrete idea of what they need to do, and if you make the goalposts clear, 730 days, I find very few people to say, well, that's too much. I think that's unreasonable. And there are exemptions. For example, you can be outside working for a Canadian company,
right, okay,
full-time abroad,
right,
and in those cases, often that'll count as time being spent in Canada. So if your company is sending you abroad to work for a few months or work for a year and you're coming back, that time will count. Traveling abroad with a Canadian spouse. So, for example, your partner gets a job working overseas for a year or two and you travel with them.
Right.
If you're with a Canadian citizen spouse, that time will also count towards your residency obligation. So there's some very reasonable exceptions to the rule, too.
But notwithstanding the exceptions, stuff happens.
Right, of course.
And so these cases do come up, and I can speak to two examples that both went to tribunals recently. And in one case, the family had been outside of Canada far too much, with their children. There were still a couple of children in Canada, but the tribunal looked at their situation, could not give any good reason as to why they had spent so much time outside of Canada. They hadn't sought to return in a reasonable period of time.
Right.
There was no justification for the absence. There had not been sufficient establishment by these family members in Canada. The tribunal had no difficulty saying, no, you've lost your status.
Oh, okay. So
End of story.
the permanent residency was rescinded.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Okay. In another case, the husband had been outside of Canada, but the wife and children had remained in Canada. And the husband had been outside of Canada because of dire financial circumstances that arose that he had to resolve, and because family members, parents of the mother and the father, had passed away in succession. 3 of them in 4 years.
Uh-huh.
All right. And they had to deal with that. And so he did come back, but he didn't have the right number of days. And he didn't lie to immigration. He told the truth.
Right.
He said, here's the days I've been away. And when they looked at the circumstances, they reported him. He had to go to the appeal, but the appeal looked at his situation and said, you know what? We'll let this one pass.
You know, I think, guys, probably the thing that most Canadians would base their opinions, I like that, I don't like that, on is us being seen to be taken advantage of. We're notoriously generous people, and we're a wealthy country. And we're pretty good to people and to each other. But when we are exploited shamelessly, then we get our backs up. We see we don't like to be taken advantage of, especially when we're so generous in the first place. And that's where we kind of get our backs up.
Well, when you talk about snowboards and stuff, if you take a look at the MSP rules, is one example for that, where we have, you know, about 4.5 million people living in British Columbia. We have something like 9 million MSP cards out there.
Oh, really?
So we have 2-for-1 MSP cards issued. And so now you see these, there's a big emphasis when you're getting your new cards for services in British Columbia on checking the identity, making sure you have immigration status. Is your immigration status up to date? Have you been here? Mm-hmm. And that's part of addressing this problem of the fraud that's been going on.
Right. Right. We've only got a minute or so left, and perhaps it's the wrong time to ask, but we see, and this is not necessarily, you see people being hassled on SkyTrain for not paying their fares. Mm-hmm. They get identified by the transit police, and somewhere or another there's an exchange of information, and this person turns out to be an illegal in our midst. Is that now part of the procedure? Are all Canadian police forces now linked to the border agency?
I can speak to that directly.
Go ahead.
Yeah, so there was an agreement between the transit police, right? The transit police, which is a separate police force, and the immigration department, CBSA, that they would call CBSA and say, is this person, wanted? And what would happen is, if they were not wanted, they would issue the warrant right then. And so that woman that died in custody, that's exactly what happened. She wasn't wanted on a generalized warrant. What happens is they call, immigration says, we don't have her, we're going to issue the warrant right now. CBSA would issue the warrant right away at that minute, and they would hold her for the pickup.
So
she was an overstay. That was the Mexican lady that committed suicide in the holding cell at the airport.
A tragic story, too.
Yeah.
So, but we have now police officers on transit systems acting as customs agents.
No, they've canceled that agreement now.
Oh, yeah. I see.
They will not participate in that anymore.
Well, they know that's very reassuring.
But
because
there's still a very strong relationship between CBSA and the regular police force.
Right.
So that if anybody is picked up and is involved in the judicial system for criminality, their status is checked out by the police and is communicated to CBSA so that both sides are aware right away whether they're dealing with an immigrant, whether they're dealing with a visitor, whether they're dealing with a citizen, and whether there's going to be repercussions arising from the criminality.
And that brings us right back to where we began the program with talking about those reasons by which people are excluded from being allowed into Canada, and criminal behavior and criminality is definitely at the top of that list.
Yeah, sure.
Interesting stuff. Rudy and Gordon, thanks so much for coming by again. It's always a pleasure. This is fascinating, and lots more topics still to discover in the weeks ahead. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Sterling.
And we'll see you next time, next weekend, on The Law Show.